So far up to this point, we've assumed that the labor market was free, that everything was, we didn't factor in any kind of cost, any kind of difficulties. We assumed competition, so forth. So we assumed that everything would run smoothly. In reality, however, there are what are called frictions in the labor market, something that doesn't let the market perform as it would without anything standing in its way. So far, we have made a couple of assumptions. First, we have assumed that wage is given. And so what happens is the wage gets determined by the market, and when that's the case, each firm then takes that wage as given. So no matter how many people they employ, they pay them the same wage. So this is a horizontal supply curve to the firm. We've also assumed that all labor costs are variable. But then what happens when it becomes costly to make changes, to hire, to fire, so forth? Okay, what if it's more than is on the surface? So first off, let's talk about unions. So when it comes to unions, unions are groups that negotiate on behalf of a collective unit. So everyone in the union, they act as one individual, and they have the unions come in and they negotiate on behalf of all their members. Okay. So the main goals of unions are employment and wages advancement, to get more people hired and pay them higher wages. But in reality, that becomes tough to do, and so the other side of that is to get increased wages for their members without large decreases in the demand for their workers. So when it comes to unions, elasticities are very, very big, and unions want inelastic demands. So consider this case here. So we have two demand curves, demand A and demand B. Demand A is relatively elastic, to where the demand is very sensitive to changes in wage, and demand B is fairly inelastic. So let's say that these are two different groups that unions are representing. And in starting out, they're both getting that W0. Now for both, the unions are able to negotiate a wage up to W1. So for both groups, Group A and Group B, the union is able to get an increase in pay from W0 to W1. Well, what are the effects on the number of workers that the firm wants to employ at that point? Well, with A, which has an elastic demand, what happens is we go from L0 and L0, and when it's wage 0, and when it's wage 1, it's going to be L1B. And so you see a large decrease in the demand for workers. So in this area, the unions would have to sacrifice a lot of workers to get that wage increase. If, however, it was the Group B, what would happen is that wage increase, because it's inelastic, we would go from L0 to L1A. So the decrease in workers would not be that severe. And so this kind of just illustrates why they want inelastic demand. And so the wage gains they get don't come at the expense of too many or a large decrease in the amount of workers. So what exactly do unions want? Well, if they want to find places that have inelastic demand, they want to find places where they have bargaining power, to where the workers are important, they can't be easily substituted, they have a low wage elasticity demand. Unions also want to find ways to strive to reduce those labor elasticities, right, those wage elasticity demand. They can do this by, for example, creating less substitutes. And so there's a lot of lobbying that happens with unions. Right? They go down to Washington and they can push for more stricter international trade standards. And so if there's more international trade standards where it's more costly for other companies to import goods in, then there's going to be more demand for there's going to be more demand for the workers in this country. And so if the wage goes up, they're going to have more power to do that. Whereas if the wage goes up, they can just send the jobs out of the country, okay, to do it over there. Well, then there's going to be a large decrease in employment. So they want to strive to reduce those labor elasticities. And finally, they want to seek out workers where the demand is inelastic. So unions, they're on the lookout for areas to unionize, and when they do that, they want to try to find places where they can go and have success. And so by doing that, they want to look for the labor markets with high or low labor elasticity. So now let's talk about the cross-wage elasticity of demand. So the cross-wage elasticity of demand is a measure of basically how responsive is the demand of one unit of an input to a change in the pay of another unit. And so when you talk about the cross wage, it's how is one type of labor affected by a change in the wage of another. And this is calculated. We have our two down here. So we have eta, again the symbol we use for elasticity, jk. And so this is going to respond or measure what is the change in employment, percentage change in employment of one factor of labor, J, to a change in the wage of another factor, K, and vice versa. So now, we talked about this before, and for the most part, we're going to be assuming that goods are substitutes in production. And what substitutes in production means is that you can produce the good using a combination of those two inputs, which means that if you want to produce the same amount, if you increase one type of input, you would decrease the other. Okay, they're interchangeable in a way. So when you look at the cross-wage elasticity demand, the sign matters. Now, just because they are substitutes in production doesn't mean that they would be substitute, or that if they're, that overall, if you increase the wage of one, the demand of the other is going to go up or down. So, for example, if it's positive, that means that if you increase the price of one unit, the demand of the other, the employment demand of the other, is going to go up. These are called gross substitutes. I'll explain more in that in a second. Now, if it's negative, they're gross complements. If you increase the price of one input, you decrease the demand of the other. So what that depends on is the scale and the substitution effects. So if you remember the scale effect, or let's look at it here. So let's say there's two types of labor, adult labor and teen labor, A and T. So we're going to be looking at the effect of the demand for teen labor on the wage, the effect of the wage on adult labor on the demand for teen labor. So the percentage change in employment demand for teens divided by percentage change in wage for adults. So if the wage of adults goes up, okay, there's two effects. First, let's look at the substitution effect, and that's the simplest. So the substitution effect, that is the wage of adults goes up, it becomes more expensive to employ adults, so you're going to employ less adults and substitute more teens. So from the substitution effect, if the wage of adults goes up, the demand for teens is going to go up. So it's going to be, okay. Now the scale effect, however, is about the product. So remember the scale effect, so as the wage of adults goes up, it's going to become more expensive to produce the good, and so the price is going to go up and quantity demand is going to go down, and as a result there's going to be less need for both adult labor and teen labor, but specifically on teen labor, the demand for teen labor is going to go down. So what happens is the scale effect says that as the wage of one goes up, the demand of the other is going to go down. Substitution effect says as the wage goes up, the demand of the other is going to go up. So which effect is better or is bigger is what's going to cause the gross complements or gross substitutes. So again, if the price of the one good input goes up, right, the demand of the other goes up. Well, in that case, this increase in demand from the substitution effect is going to be more powerful than the decrease in demand from the scale effect. And so when this happens, okay, the substitution effect is greater than the scale effect. Okay, so that's why they're gross substitutes. If it's negative, if the price of one input goes up, the demand of the other goes down, so the scale effect decrease is greater than the substitution effect increase. And so if that's the case, then they are gross complements. So if we talk about this, what has happened, the signs, so forth, what has been shown from studies that have been done. So if you look at labor and energy and labor materials, you find that labor and energy, labor and materials, these are different inputs. They're substitutes in production, but their elasticities are small. Their cross elasticity is small. Skilled and unskilled workers are substitutes in production. Okay? But skilled are more likely to be complements with capital than unskilled. So again, gross complements means that if the price goes up of one, the demand for the other goes down. So that means that if the wage of skilled workers goes up, you would expect the demand on labor to go down. And that's because the scale effect is going to be large there. Okay. And so that's what happens with skilled workers are more likely to be complements than capital. The own wage elasticity of unskilled tends to be greater than skilled workers. Okay. So if you think about that, with unskilled workers, they tend to be a little more replaceable, and so the wage elasticity for them tends to be a little bit higher. Whereas with skilled workers, it's more difficult to replace them because they have certain skills. So this is just a couple ways that we look at elasticity, cross wage elasticity.